Emmanuel, would you like me?
Oh, this is great. So, as you can see, we have some technical issues. It seems that if I share the screen, I can't move my slides.
You share your screen, and then go into the actual PowerPoint and make it full screen. And that will do it as a presentation. So then go down as if you were to start the PowerPoint itself.
That way?
Yep. And now use your forward and back arrows.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That will help me too.
Okay, so we were supposed to have a few more people. It's the first European studies or European cluster, a research cluster presentation this year. We'll have, I think, a few more. And you should look at our web page to see when they're scheduled. They're all scheduled on a Tuesday, and I think we have almost 3 per term, but none in the summer, so 6 overall. And this first talk is just about the Brexit impact on the European Union. I've done some research on the Brexit impact on the UK, and I wrote a short paper for a Japanese colleague journal this past spring. And I wanted to look at the impact of Brexit on the EU. And one of the things then that I noticed, for instance, is that Amy and Michel Sini already published something like this. It's very, on a similar topic, it's very controversial. It's kind of interesting because a lot of colleagues see great political impact. Other colleagues do very specific studies. And so I'll just talk about a few things that I've looked in detail that I think are interesting. So I look at the budgetary impact, and then I look at the economic impact, and then I talk a little bit about the impact on the future of politics, but it's underdeveloped in the talk, and I intend to develop it a bit more. And then I look at the whole issue around the Northern Ireland situation, the islands of Ireland situation, because it's one of the issues that is a little bit difficult right now. So really focusing on some of those issues. So the big picture is this. There are broad budgetary and economic impact on the EU that I think are quite interesting. One of which is that the Union will be smaller in terms of population, but it also be smaller in terms of wealth and in terms of overall market size. And so it is having an impact on the European Union, 27 countries. As a result of this, and it's a bit of a debate still, but I looked at the number carefully, there is a smaller budget. This is something I'm going to go in more details as we go through the talk. But I think it's quite interesting what I found. I won't go in the details right now, but the smaller budget has consequences for the future of Europe and for the way member states will look at the EU budget. Also, there is a lot of writing on some of the, in a way, ideological consequences of the Brexit, and that's the part that is a little bit developed in the talk, but are quite interesting, I think, because we see basically a bit of a transformation of the foundation of, or the direction, the foundation and direction of the European Union. which I will discuss this a little bit. And then I'm not discussing these very much, but there are obviously institutional impact for the parliament. For instance, I illustrate this here very briefly, and for the council and council of ministers, the European Council and Council of Ministers, because the representation change. I think they are interesting because most of the EU institutions, the building that hosts the institutions, have been built a certain way to welcome a certain size and a certain number of member states. And then so all of this has to, in a way, be reconfigured. And that's one of the things that I think is particularly interesting when you look at the Brexit, is that you basically open the door to asking questions about, you know, the way the institutions are built, the way the Brussels basically and the buildings are also done, but also a lot of very deep-seated assumptions about how the EU works. I'll come back to this towards the end of the talk. So interestingly, you know, and maybe not discussed enough, the EU depends in a way, or the EU economy is in great part influenced by the UK economies. Because the UK is one of the largest of the economies. And I'll come back to this, but one of the things that is really interesting is that the UK will become the third largest trading partner of the EU, whether there is a deal or not. And so in a way, it's, you know, I'm trying to highlight here the fact that when we're looking at Brexit, we're basically looking at a separation out of the EU, but certainly in terms of trade, it should have tremendous and add tremendous pressure on both sides. The top trading partner for the EU right now is the United States, and second China, and the UK would be third. So it does put things, you know, into average. Its per capita average is higher. In other words, it's one of the richest countries in the EU, and that is why we see in the first slide there is a drop in the per capita GDP. It's also a net contributor. In other words, it impacts the EU budget, and it will impact the EU budget. It has impacted, and it will impact even more the EU budget in the future. But anyway, so I will discuss the small. I will show you why. So I start with this slide to discuss the impact on EU funds or EU budget. That's kind of the relationship, and I take the data from Bill 4 because it's less controversial than if I was to take, you know, the 2018-19 that are really very up-to-date data. But on the other hand, we have difficulty seeing an alignment on the numbers between the EU itself in its own accounting and the UK itself. But the picture is this: the UK used to pay about 18 billion per year, but it had a rebate. And so one of the things that was controversial, but has in a way unified the states behind the negotiation, is that the UK was the only member states that, of all the 28, that benefited a rebate negotiated between Mitterrand and Thatcher at the time when they joined. And the rebate was of 5 billion. And then one thing that was never really quite clearly presented during the UK campaign was that obviously, although it's a net contributor, the EU has programs that are impacting UK citizens and corporations across all of the UK, and that these programs obviously have a certain size. So when we look at, you know, the overall picture of what the UK should pay, or the overall picture of what the UK should pay minus the rebate, minus the amount of money that the EU spends, we still have a substantial amount of money that stays. And basically, one of the things that we see is that somebody's going to have to carry that, right? Because it is a new cost. What happens there is that the other 27 member states have to share that budgetary difference. The UK withdraw, And what stays, according to the 2014 numbers, is that basically 7 billion have to be found, right, to basically balance every year the EU budget. So it's not negligible, but it's a small amount in percentage overall of the EU budget. But some people, some countries have to, so I come back to this just to show you the details from 2014. Where are the 7 billion? Where do they come from? And it's the difference between, you know, what is paid and what is received. And so the net loss is right there, 7 billion. And I used the European Commission data because, you know, I think that it really mirrors quite well what the UK has had in place here. Now, some things are here very interesting, and I highlight some of them here. Certain very specific countries will carry most of the cost to the EU budget. So one of them is obviously Germany. The second highest contributor here is France. So you can see that Germany here will pay about 2.5 billion in 2014 budget, right? These are projections from the 2014 budget. That France is paying almost 1.5 billion. And then comes Italy, and then you see other countries like Sweden and so on and so forth. You see that other countries have basically agreed and see their contribution to the EU increase. But what is also really interesting and counterintuitive is that there are very specific countries that are benefiting from the UK withdrawal. In other words, the amount of money that they have to pay into the EU budget is going down. So Bulgaria is one, but one that I find really kind of interesting and makes me laugh a little bit is the Netherlands. The Netherlands also see a contribution that goes down, and I can't find it on my table, it's right here, by 71 million euros per year. So this is unexpected, but it, in my mind, it contextualizes the negotiations, and this is kind of why I wanted to look at, you know, the cost of the impact of the Brexit on the EU budget specifically, because what we see here is that the rebate becomes well known, and the rebate has a general impact on, I would say, the diplomacy and the relationship between the different countries. But also certain specific countries, you know, small countries, do see their situation in the EU as benefiting from the EU withdrawal, from the Brexit, the UK withdrawal from the EU. And also something really interesting in my mind is that the cost to the budget is really carried by very specific countries, two of which are the largest economies in the EU, Germany and France. And I will come back to this because it's something that I found also when we look at, for instance, the impact on access and impact on European regions. So to summarize what I just discussed, what we can see is that the EU budget will be marginally impacted because it's, you know, a small single-digit percentage of the annual budget of the European Union. But it is not completely negligible because it impacts certain countries much more than others. Both Germany and France are the ones that are the most impacted, and some of the smallest countries, as I just discussed, Greece, Bulgaria, Latvia, and the Netherlands are less impacted. Now, some of the remarks that I have here are, you know, remarks that have to do with whether the UK will be a net gainer. In other words, if you stop paying, let's say, these 7 billion contribution to the EU, is the UK really gaining from the situation or not? And one of the things that I want to highlight here is that if they don't have a good deal, it will cost them nearly as much, but it could be very easily much worse. So I highlight this by just giving an example that if we fall back onto a World Trade Organization sets of rules, right, it will basically cost them about standard plus 2% across all different kinds of trade, will cost them almost 5 billion a year. So to basically save 2 billion out of 7, they would still have to pay about 5 million to have access to the EU market. And this is obviously an outstandingly good option on the World Trade Organization system, but it could be much higher in certain sectors and certain part of the economy. Another thing that I'm highlighting here, which I think is really interesting, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes, is that if they want to have EEA status, which I will discuss in a second, the European Economic Area status, which is like Norway, well, it is interesting to know that Norway pays into the EU budget about 3.5 billion per year. And that is, in a way, a fairly large amount when we come back to the UK saying, well, then you save only 3.5 billion, but you still have to pay 3.5 billion, but now you are not a member anymore. Maybe it works well for a small economy like Norway, which is niched inside and has, in a way, been able to negotiate its status, including its payments, without being a fully fledged member of the European Union. But for the UK, it would be a serious setback because it means that you pay into the economy. You're a much larger economy, so you would probably pay much more than Norway, and you still don't have access to rulemaking, which is one of the top features of being a member of the European Union. Just food for thoughts, right? The two bookshelves, bookends here being the World Trade Rules versus EEA status, and what conditions are there to be negotiated and the impact on the EU budget. So I'm going to pass on this slide, but basically here what I highlight is that there are, and I just did this as a, brief reminder that there are all kind of issues for the UK economy itself. Now there are obviously different options, and some of the options involve, for instance, looking at the European Economic Area or the European Free Trade Association. In other words, other free trade regimes, smaller and more specific, which, as we all know from the media, have been obviously aired and discussed almost segment by segment, chapter by chapter, and have been quite difficult. And that includes also looking at, different options. So I just want to highlight them very briefly. The Norwegian option has obviously serious competitive advantage because it would give access to common market, but also has some negative, which I've already highlighted, which is that you have to follow, European Economic Area rules, and you also have to pay into the EU budget. The Switzerland option is it's a little less comprehensive, and I'm not going in great detail here because I want to highlight the different options that I see the UK has, and anyway reframe the negotiations here. But it's basically saying that specific industries have access to free trade, others don't, and then also you lose access to all kind of agencies and intergovernmental partnerships such as, Erasmus and anyway, a number of programs that are managed by the EU that are basically outside of this. You could also basically renegotiate a free trade agreement like what Canada has done recently, which, is an interesting free trade because even from a Canadian perspective, it's more ambitious a free trade agreement than the former NAFTA or the US MECA that we have. We don't say this very often in Canada, but it is deeper and it involves in particular, which is very interesting to us, the idea, and I mean Canada here, government procurements, right? So Canada and the EU now can basically compete on government procurements. And this is something, that would be an interesting, in a way, free trade agreements if it were, in a way, progressing that way. And then there is the worst case, which I've already discussed, at a very low possible rate of, plus 2%. But that would be obviously the worst situation. Now, that's my transition into discussing more of the market access and some of the impact on the EU. These different models will impact the EU economy and will impact specific regions. And I use maps here and then I'll review countries you'll see, because I think it's really interesting what in a way I didn't know. It's not discussed immensely in the literature, but it's there. On a scale of 1 to 5, so if you were to say that you trade with the UK regions, you have European regions trading with UK regions, 2% of all your international trade go to the UK, or 4%, or 8%, or 10%, or 12%. What you have here in the darkest regions is a scale of 1 to 5. And what we discover is that the regions of Europe that will be the most impacted by Brexit are actually not in continental Europe. They're all in the UK. So whether we like it or not, the trade dependency falls onto the UK, but, and this is my point here, there is a clear impact on very specific countries across continental Europe. And some of the media, some colleagues have worked on this, obviously. Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, and the Czech Republic are all here in orange. But see, when we think about the negotiations and we think also about the political context, certain states, certain member states have very limited impact. What they see is an increase in their budget. Some of those, by the way, I highlighted, 5 of them, pay less into the EU because of Brexit. So from a very self-centered but political perspective, the Brexit is to their advantage. In particular, if it has no impact on the economy of their regions. Now look carefully at this map and you can see that outside of the core of the continental European member states, EU member states, most of the peripheral states, including most of Spain and Portugal, all of Italy, Greece, and then we can go, on the eastern side, the front, right? Starting with, Sweden and Finland, and we go down through all of the eastern states, have no economic impact. Their regions are not affected. But what we discovered, that I discovered that I think is really interesting, is that certain regions, specifically in the south of Germany, are impacted. But really the discovery is that you see that Germany is impacted, you see that Czechia is impacted, you see that the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg are impacted, and France. So with the exception of the Czech Republic, all of those are wealthy, powerful EU member states who have greatly benefited from EU integration. And it's also interesting to see in this image, if you want, that the two largest payee into the EU budget, Germany and France, are also the ones which regions are the most impacted by the Brexit. So what we see here is obviously sets the stage to a very specific type of public diplomacy, if you want, inside the EU vis-a-vis the negotiations with the UK. I've always asked myself, why is it that it's a Frenchman, Barnier, who is the lead? And why is it that he can be so firm? And why is it that all the member states have aligned themselves behind? Well, now you can almost say to your students in the classroom is because most of the 27 member states are not really affected. Some of them are really benefiting from it because they have larger amounts coming back from Brussels. And instead of being net contributor, for instance, like the Netherlands, now they are net recipients, right? So it really changes in a way, the politics. And the number of states that are affected is very small, right? That are really affected. Their economy is, or if not very small, at least limited. Now, when we look at specific countries, one of the countries that doesn't appear very much in my map. Let's see if I can go back. How do I go back? Ireland is one of the countries that is quite affected, more so than Germany, right? So let me discuss this now. So a no-deal Brexit would really hurt some countries, and we can see some of them here. And so what we discover here is that the percentage impact gives us a different picture of the impact than looking at regions, right? From a political perspective, it's quite interesting because it would mean that probably in Ireland, certain regions will be impacted, certain specific industries are much more impacted than certain regions, but we still see where the impact is in terms of percentage. And then we have illustrations here of some of the sectors. The car sector has been well identified as to why it's also obviously impacting Germany for that reason. And then meats or food industries, and then pharmaceuticals. So we can see here quite well that, again, the impact on specific countries is quite well and easy to identify, and that the economic impact is quite moderate, but for instance, Ireland. Well, I'll come back to this about Ireland. So some of the two lessons that we have here is that the EU budget is carried by possibly the EU budget deficit because of Brexit is basically carried out by possibly 4 of the largest states, but primarily Germany and France, and also others, including Spain. And one of the questions, and then also what we see is that the market impact is really quite focused on some of the core continental European countries, right? But doesn't really affect the periphery. Now, when we look at the future of politics, and there's quite a bit of writing on this, this is the part that is underdeveloped in the talk. What I find really interesting is that the UK remains a top trading partner, but certain policies will really greatly benefit from this. And for instance, we've already seen, since the negotiation started, a transformation of all of the activities around the Europe of defense, and some of the activities, including, for instance, the Permanent Structured Cooperation or the Defense Fund, which, by the way, in the post-COVID budget, right, where the EU member states have decided to co-fund and borrow and, in a way, co-guarantee a common debt, which is a first in the EU history, there is substantial amount of money towards a greater defense and foreign affairs cooperation across the different member states. So we see certain types of political forms of integration are in a way benefiting from the situation. Now I'm going to talk about Northern Ireland, but before I go in Northern Ireland, I just want to discuss this part a little bit more. One of the real interests that I have behind this is asking questions about the future of integration in Europe. And one of the hypotheses I'm working on is that it is going to have not a conjunctural, but a structural impact on European integration. And I would, and this is kind of what I'm looking at, I would hypothesize that certain policies that have been defended by the Southern European member states will become reasons for greater integration in the future. So contrary to a lot of observers, I think that the result of Brexit is going to shift integration, in a way, leadership from the Northern European towards the Southern European member states. And I think this is something that we already see appear, in a way, in the recent negotiations that have to do, in a way, with the recent EU budget, the COVID-19 budget that was negotiated early this month, where we see that European member states, all of them have walked out of the deal with a benefit, right? More funding for Southern European countries, including greatly indebted ones such as Greece, Italy, or Spain, Portugal, but also much more centralization and control over the usage of the fund, as some Eastern and Northern European countries wanted. So in other words, I see the possibility of an interesting transformation of the internal diplomacy across the different member states. On top of this, as you noted, the two economies that are really carrying the Brexit in terms of contribution, both of them are net contributors to the EU budget, but also the one that will suffer the most from the Brexit, France and Germany, as you have noticed, are tight allies and have led most of the negotiation, including the very recent new budget negotiations, where both Macron and Merkel were very much on the front line, side by side, despite their known disagreements, right? So it's quite interesting to see that all of this suddenly makes sense and in a way creates a new coherence for the future of Europe. Now I want to come back very briefly and close on this to the Irish situation, to explain a little bit why, in a way, and discuss a little bit why the Irish situation is of such importance for Barnier, and why is the withdrawal agreement in a way something that shouldn't be shouldn't be tampered with by the UK. And I have some numbers here as you know, I have, I look here at the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And one of the things that I think is really interesting in that slide is that you can see that there is complete integration, even dependency of Northern Ireland on the rest of Ireland. And it's a really interesting dependency. We also see that EU funding into Northern Ireland is a fairly high level, part of the GDP, 8%. And so I would say that it explains, some of the insistence in numbers, in a way, for a deal that would allow what they call the whole island economy to not be split again. Now, Barnier, in his absolute latest speech of early September, talked about an all-island economy as the absolute priority for the EU, and I cite him, right? The essential is to protect the all-island economy. This remains an absolute priority for the EU. But you have it here in basically a few numbers where you discover that, for instance, agriculture of Northern Ireland is particularly dependent on EU subsidies because for every single pound earned by a Northern Irish farmer, 87 pence per pound comes from EU subsidies. In other words, Northern Irish farmers only exist because of the funds that are transferred from Brussels into Northern Ireland. And it still is an economy that really very much depends on farming. Here I highlight very briefly the kind of money that is in the programs towards Northern Ireland, just to show that, despite the small size of the different Northern Irish counties, we can see that the EU has invested massively. The CAP Pillar 1 is is the agricultural policy Pillar 1. So it's basically, that's where you can see the 87 pence per pound. But you can see also that there's substantial amount of money that are involved, for instance, in the Interreg and the peace programs, which are sizable, almost 500 million euros, right? When we think about a program that is set up for 5-6 years, it's almost 100 million per year, 100 million per year, which is quite significant to basically maintain peace. Now, in the past, there were different options for the Northern Irish situation. And these were designed thanks to the big program, right? My colleague, Kate Hayward at Belfast, Queen's Belfast, shared these documents with me, and we co-published a document on this, the big program and her research institute. And one of the things that we see here is that there are different options. The European Economic Area, the European Free Trade Area, the World Organization, and some of the other ones are there. But I want to come back to the first one. The one that is being implemented today is basically a European Union option. In other words, it's the idea that the all-island economy remains whole and is untouched. And this is what the controversy we've seen in the media this summer and early fall is all about. It's a very difficult implementation because it means that the EU custom union would be in the Irish Sea. And I'm not sure, it's quite clear to most people, but it basically means that the economy of Northern Ireland remains part of the European Union. It implies that the European Union customs code would be applied to all the goods that enter the Irish Islands, but also would that all of the goods leaving the Northern Ireland would basically clear through EU procedures and formalities. And there is here something that is quite interesting to highlight. And that is that Belfast is actually a very important trading port. It's actually the second largest trading port for the UK. And I insist on this. And so it's important that these procedures be extremely well implemented there. especially because something that I'm going to say now, which is not very well known, is that most people who trade or produce and then sell goods worldwide from the Republic of Ireland actually move their goods through Northern Ireland, through the UK, into the EU. And so the EU and the UK and the Republic of Ireland have worked on a transportation agreement so that there would be, in a way, a corridor of goods that would be under EU customs code that would be able to be shipped from the Republic of Ireland all the way into the EU through the UK. That is a very complex thing to do because at the same time you have goods that are entering, from the UK into Northern Ireland. And so you have here, in a way, a very interesting double border. You have the custom border of the EU that is superimposed onto Britain's, if you want, border, trading border in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland becomes, in a way, a trading platform, and it has to be extremely well implemented, and it requires tremendous involvement from the UK there. Some of these have important implication in terms of custom capacity, which the UK doesn't have yet. I'm going to pass on those slides and go to the conclusion, but as I'm concluding, I just want to say this much. To this day, the UK is not able to deal with its new custom relation with the EU. For the longest time, custom for the UK goods was cleared in the Netherlands and in Belgium through the private and semi-private service firms that deal with this in the harbors established there, right? Rotterdam and Antwerp and so on and so forth. And it's quite interesting to see or to know that the impact on customs will be a multiplication from about 55 million custom slips that the UK has the ability to deal with to about 555 million, so 10 times more, which is a huge issue and a very serious worry for Barnier. He reminds the UK of this in his latest speech, where he says that, on the date, January 1st, 2021, on that date, the UK will leave the single market, the custom unions, and all EU policies and all our international agreements. And then he goes down, I'm not going to read all the details, but he goes down there to say this: on the EU side, our major entry and exit points are ready. On the EU side, Dunkirk and Calais are the two major entry points, and together they have invested over 2 billion euros in new infrastructures to be able to deal with the entry-exit of UK or British goods, right? Goods coming from Britain, but also to streamline, to allow goods coming from Ireland across those thresholds much faster. And one of the things that Barnier is worried about is that as much as the convention that will allow the traffic of those goods between Ireland through the UK to the EU and trade that is in a way UK trade dependent on the EU, the UK is not ready and far from being ready. So the impact here is really interesting because we can see that actually the whole Irish discussion that I just highlighted here, in a way, is a forefront of some of the market discussions that we're having, right? It's all about custom issues, duties, and revenues. And that the EU is very much worried about the impact that the UK, in a way, would have or would let the Republic of Ireland carry because of administrative delays and inabilities to deal with these issues. I believe today that it's probably why we have all these negotiations around the Northern Irish, in a way, situation, right? Because as I said, it's a double border with an economic border in the Irish Sea, but at the same time, you have certain goods that come from the UK that can still go into Northern Ireland. And so there is a commission that works on this and is actually itemizing right now all of the goods that are basically allowed across both borders, making the situation extremely complex. Now, my conclusion is this, and I think it's really interesting. Costs are real, but EU members share them, with 2 EU members carrying most of the costs, Germany and France. The economy's costs are also on those 2 richest states of the EU membership and their largest firms. There are some exceptions. You know, as I highlighted in the talk, there are certain countries that have industrial plants that will be affected. Latvia is one of them, right? The Czech Republic is one of them. And this is because they depend on very specific parts of the auto industry or the pharmaceutical industries, for instance. But these are large Central European, German capitalized firms. And then the largest part, the Northern Irish situation is really an interesting one because it is where we see the implementation of the, in a way, the EU rule onto you know, Belfast, which is likely to become, in a way, a point of entry exit of EU trade, and in a way, the juncture of a lot of the trade that is going on between the UK and the economy of the Irish islands, in a way, the way Calais and Dunkirk have become, right? They become really important logistic platforms, and they become highly regulated because so much of the trade goes through this. Thank you very much. So if you have questions or comments, I will take them now. Bud?
Yeah, thanks very much, Emmanuel. The detail that you provided is really fascinating. I haven't been, I haven't been following this other than in kind of general news, the stuff that you get in the news. So the details are interesting. You may have covered this in earlier talks. The things that people that I work with are interested in are the access to EC, research funding, and Erasmus funding. What have you been hearing about those access, those research and mobility programs, those kinds of things?
Well, from what I know at this time, the current contracts will be honored, but the EU loses access afterwards. The UK loses access to all the Erasmus Plus funds. So it will have access in a way like we do. So, you know, it will have access like a Canadian university can have access to some funds. But the criteria and the envelopes, you know, the amount of money available is very different. So it will be a foreign partner of the EU.
Yeah.
After, you know, after basically one thing that we can say, 25 years of being maybe the lead country in the study of European integration and the lead country in Europeanizing, you know, teaching programs at their universities, because the UK has been so successful. They are, you know, moving beyond even states such as Iceland or Norway that have access to these educational funds.
Thanks.
So, yeah. I should thank you all, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Emmanuel, for your presentation. I have two questions. One more theoretical. This case study of the North Ireland and the Brexit, how this case study could illustrate your theoretical BIG framework. You call that functional border.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my first question. How this case study of the Brexit and the complexity between the overlapping jurisdiction on North Ireland with the custom or the EU system of law, it could illustrate this concept of BIG, functional or territorial border.
What I think is really, really interesting is that, you know, as I talked about, you know, the EU has now a custom code. And the custom code, you know, in most people's mind is something that you implement at the boundary or in warehouses where goods come in and where goods basically sit in until they're cleared. But what we see being done by the EU is actually implement the custom code in the production process, you know, in Northern Ireland, so that they can basically travel through the UK as fast as possible. And that's the transportation agreement I made reference to, because they will be going across the UK, but they'll be EU goods. Whereas the custom code is making it very difficult for the UK goods to be in Northern Ireland. And that's the whole debate at this time, is the negotiation of what goods can be in and what goods will be out. Right, the commission that from the interviews that I have been following about the implementation of these rules in Northern Ireland, you basically have a rule of law that is the new tool of a point of entry and exit. It's a harbor, it's an airport, and it's basically, you know, the funnel for all UK goods going into the EU and or coming from from the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which are EU goods. So indeed, it's not about the boundaries, you know, the other boundaries of the Irish islands, but it's about the boundaries attached to very specific goods that are affected by the EU custom code. And you see the same issue with goods that will arrive inside the European Union as they have arrived, you know, at the major harbors, and will have to clear custom. On the UK side, they're coming into the UK and maybe basically stopped if the UK is not ready in Calais or Dunkirk. hence the infrastructures that I made reference to, right? Because the EU is assuming that the UK will not have the capacity to deal with these 500 million slips. By the way, I use the number 500 million. It's a really interesting number because it's 10 times more than what the UK capacity is. But what should really be known is that for many of those slips, it's all electronically done. However, it adds cost to the corporations that are trading massively with the EU, and so it's impacting the UK. And to a certain extent, as we've seen, certain industries such as the automobile industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and some of the agri-food industries as well, but in very small percentage across the EU. But so in my mind, the custom code is the new border, and it is a functional border. It's not a border that is affecting all the boundary lines across Europe, but it's a border that will be affecting greatly, in this case, 3 points of entry and exit: Calais, Dunkirk, and Belfast. That's it. That's where all the goods are basically going in and out through. And so these are, the 3 border gates, in a way, that are being affected. What's the other questions you had?
You wrote an article 1 month ago. It was about the European Union is stronger and unified. So if you could connect what you say today with this article, when you emphasize the fact that European Union is stronger and more unified than ever.
I know.
With this Brexit things.
I am under-impressed by Brexit, especially by the way the UK has negotiated with the EU. And I am a little bit impressed by the way the EU has been able to unify behind Michel Barnier in the negotiation regarding Brexit. So in the talk that I just gave, I kind of tried to find reasons why the EU is so strongly unified. And to sum it up, I'd say it this way. You've got 4 countries that are really affected by change in their market and trading relations with the UK, but 2 of them are the largest economies of the EU. They carry the burden. Most countries carry some of the budget differential, in their contribution to the EU budget. 5 of them benefit from the UK withdrawal. And out of the 22 remaining, the contributions are small percentage, small amounts, but the large amounts are carried by 2 states, France and Germany. So this creates a hierarchy of membership states where you see appear Germany and France, if allied, as benefiting and making the EU even stronger. So now, obviously, I have reasons to believe that the EU is stronger because 2 states, the largest ones, basically have decided that Brexit was going to be, their business and that they would basically deal with it in terms of what the EU does for the EU member states overall, and in terms of what it will do to their own market relations with the UK. And what they decided was that they could carry those costs, go forward, and even negotiate and borrow money together and create a pool of 27 member states that would co-guarantee the money that they borrowed, right? And they are moving forward. I think they are stronger than they have ever been. And I think the alliance between Macron and Merkel is surprisingly stronger than you've ever seen in EU history, actually. So that's the link with the piece that I wrote for the
Network.
network.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emmanuel.
You're welcome. Any other questions or comments?
One more from Bud.
Bud.
I just was thinking about you mentioned that Calais, Dunkirk, and Belfast will be, the ports that are, all of the trade is going to go in and out. Does that mean, I'm just thinking of Belfast and the negative impact that all of this is having on the economy, or potentially on the Northern Ireland economy. Would this mean that there will be a building up of personnel and sort of port activities in Belfast in order to handle the increase in, customs and, transportation and warehousing and so forth?
Yeah, and it's actually happening already, right?
Okay.
So I think that certainly the airport has seen some work done, and the harbor as well. So I think the real impact may come from bureaucratic delays in implementing the agreement. But Northern Ireland should not actually suffer greatly. On the contrary, Northern Ireland, of all places across the EU, should actually be a beneficiary of the Brexit, because it's becoming a major logistic
Interesting.
situation,
Yeah.
location.
Yeah, thanks.
I mean, if you look at Calais and Dunkirk, and you look at the harbor infrastructure today, compared to the ones that existed even 10 years ago, they are much larger. I don't know in terms of, it's not even twice larger. It's like multiple times larger and better staffed and more modern. It's because you have here an entry-exit point, two entry-exit points, with the third market partner of the EU, and that the custom code basically requires those infrastructures to be there. So these locations are becoming major points of entry and exit for all the goods coming from the UK or Britain into the EU. And as I highlighted, that's about 500 million custom slips. So, I think it's close to 500 million. I think I might be wrong, actually. I think it's 350 million custom slip, because the difference is worldwide trade.
Yeah.
So but still, it would mean, that all of this economic integration that we have demeaned and looked down upon during the Brexit referendum campaign is actually very real. Because it was the same market, we didn't know. Services were not taxed, producers were not taxed, goods were not taxed. And I'm thinking, financial services, marketing, accounting, legal, right? Industrial production, agri-food businesses, all of this, now it's going to have to go through the custom code. And it changes the relationship completely. So Calais and Dunkirk, obviously, are not the same harbors that they were 10 years ago. And Belfast will also be one.
Thank you.
Hey,
Hi, Emmanuel. Thanks for your presentation. It's good to see you. My own concern is with the artist, and I don't know. Obviously, this might not be within the purview of your presentation, but I'm kind of really wondering in terms of the mobility of the people, specifically artists within Brexit. Where does that leave them in terms of their relationship to wherever they are, and moving across that continent? Where does that leave the people, particularly
I
artists?
haven't looked at artists per se, but I know that labor mobility will be affected as, labor mobility will be greatly affected. So the kind of things that we've seen in the past where you have, for instance, huge transfers of money, remittances from the UK into many different EU countries, including, France and Germany and many other ones like Spain and, right? Because people worked in the UK, made money in the UK and then sent the money back home. All of this affects, EU citizens, and the reverse situation will also affect British citizens greatly. They won't be able to travel for work as easily. It's finished. It'll be more difficult for British citizens to work in the EU than it is for Canadians to work in the US. So artists in the UK, will move to Berlin.
Mm.
It's kind of a joke, but yes, it's actually already happening, right? You can see that there is some move that way, right? I'm not sure Berlin is as attractive as it was in the 90s, but certainly one of the things that is happening is that, academics, for instance, have started to move, and a lot of nationals may not stay in the UK unless they decide to, but it will solidify all of this. It will make it much more difficult for them to, navigate and live in two countries without not having the two passports, because they will need UK and EU passport to have the mobility and easy of travel and trade and work that they've had in the past. And most of them don't, right? Because most of them relied on the EU passport, and that's over.
Thanks, Emmanuel.
Okay, maybe we, thank you. I thank you very much for attending the talk. I knew I had a title that was a little bit boring, but I thought I'd have a bit more success. But I'm really glad to have had you, and I'm really glad to have done this. It's a first talk for us, and it will be on the European Union Research Cluster that we are creating this fall. And it's part of a lecture series, and I hope we have, I think we have, I wonder if I had saved actually the series page to show you. I don't know if I'm still sharing my screen, but I had saved it, but now I can't find it.
Emmanuel, I can.
Do you have it, Amanda? Could you share it?
For the
You-
Center of Excellence?
Yeah, with all the lecture series on them with the
I
dates.
will share it
Please do
in
this.
the chat. Here it is for everyone. So there's a description of the center there, and if you navigate to the left-hand side of the page, you can look at our
I
recent.
can't see it.
Oh, I just put the link, but I can share my screen if you'd like. Or you can share your screen if you want to.
I don't see what you're doing, sorry.
Oh, 1 second. There's the link in the chat.
So can you see this? Maybe not.
So you have to share your screen again.
Yeah. So we have a series of lectures on the EU this fall. The next one by Olivier Schmidtke will be exploring the rise of populism and the threats to liberal democracy, the European context, on October 20th. And then Benjamin Perrier, the complex relations between borders and the EU, November 24th. And then we'll have 3 lectures as well the following term. We don't have them there, but we will be able to show you those lectures. You should put them in your calendar and attend them. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Amanda, you have to stop the recording before the meeting ends.
Good to see you. Stephanie